Hey, church. I'm just kind of sitting here in my spare room recording this sermon for you. And honestly, over the last few days, I've spent a lot more time kind of in my head, kind of just thinking and catastrophizing and freaking out than I normally do. And I'm guessing that's probably true for a lot of you as well. Right now, we're kind of living in the middle of an unprecedented time in our history. We have this disease that we don't know really what to do with it. Is it unbelievably deadly? Is it only deadly to certain people? How contagious is it really? Who has it? Who doesn't have it? How can we know? Can we get tested? And even outside of the immediate effects of the disease, the sickness and the death that it causes, there's other concerns that come along for us because a lot of people have ended up furloughed or otherwise out of work as a result of the consequences that this disease is having on the economy. A lot of us have had to put plans on hold, whether it's visiting kids or parents or vacations that we've been saving up for a year. Uh, we've had to cancel those plans and instead board ourselves up in our homes in order to comply with what the government is ordering. Our favorite restaurants are closed. We can't go see movies, and we can't even hang out with our friends one on one and be convinced that that's a safe thing to do. Our lives have been affected in a lot of ways, and probably will continue to be affected in a lot of ways, whether this is over 2 or 3 months from now, or whether it's over a year and a half from now. Our lives will probably be affected by this for years to come between the economic ramifications and just the way it affects the way that we behave and think and work. And all of that change, all of that threat, at least for me, and I'm guessing for you as well, is frankly pretty terrifying. It's pretty anxiety inducing. And so we kind of sit here and we freak out and we get on our heads, and maybe it's even hard to breathe sometimes because we're just so worried, so anxious about what's going to happen. And then we read verses like we find in Philippians 4 6 through 7. And it says, "Don't be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." And you read that, it says, don't be anxious, be thankful, present your requests to God. And it says it like it's so easy. And I read that and I say, I wish I wasn't anxious. I wish that I could be thankful. I really do. But then I think about how I just accepted a job in Southern Illinois, in a state that I've never lived in and never done anything more than just drive through. And I accepted that job without ever even visiting the church in person because I couldn't, because of this virus. I think about how my wife and I, after not even a year of marriage, are now looking for an apartment and we can't even look at the apartment in person. There's a chance we'll be moving into a new home, that we will sign a contract that says we're going to stay here for a year, and we might move into that home without ever getting to see it in person before the move-in day. I think about my friend Mike, whose dad was sick with cancer back in South Carolina. And Mike couldn't travel home and see him because he knew even if he got to South Carolina in time, the hospital wouldn't let him into his dad's room because he would be considered a virus threat. And he would have to quarantine for 14 days. And well, Mike's dad didn't have 14 days. And Mike's dad passed away without Mike by his side because of this virus. I think about my friends Maddie and Martin, who already were having enough financial issues as it is because, they're college students and they're training to be missionaries, which are like the two poorest people on the face of the earth are college students and missionaries, and they're both. And now this virus comes along and it just wrecks their job prospects. It makes them put everything on hold for months, or it could end up being years longer than what they wanted just because of the state that the economy's in, and the fact that it's very difficult for either one of them to make money right now, to pay off their student loans, to start saving up to go into the missions field. I think about situations like that. I think about how I can't visit my parents because travel isn't safe. I think about how we can't visit Maggie's mom because she has MS and we could potentially get her very sick. I think about how for many of you, you may have been cooped up in the house for weeks at this point, barely ever leaving unless you're shopping for groceries, and frankly, you and your spouse are at each other's throats. Or maybe you're just getting stir crazy. You're not fighting or anything, but it's just like, man, when do I get out of this house? And it's just starting to mess with your head a little bit. Your brain just feels like mush because you just need to go out. You just need to interact with someone. You just need to be able to do something outside of the house. I think about how for some of you, you may not have a job right now. Maybe you're just furloughed. They want you to come back when this is all over, but right now there's just no work to be done. And so you're asking yourself, how am I going to be able to pay all the bills that I have? The stimulus check is only going to go so far. How am I going to make this work? And when I read those verses in Philippians, I think about these situations and I go, God, I'd love to not be anxious. God, I would love to be thankful. I just don't feel it right now. So, what can we do? What can we tell ourselves? What can we teach ourselves? What can we say or have said to us that will help us to feel a little bit more joy, a little bit less anxiety? What can we do to feel a little more thankful in the middle of a world-changing epidemic? I think Paul actually gives us a little bit of an answer. It's actually not in Philippians. It's not in that passage that I just read you a moment ago. It's actually in Ephesians chapter 3. I'll go ahead and give you a minute to turn there. Again, Ephesians chapter 3, starting in verse 14. Again, that's Ephesians chapter 3, beginning in verse 14. And since this is recorded, you can pause me whenever if you need more time to flip. I'm going to go ahead and go there, and I'll read it to you. I'll be in the NIV. Ephesians chapter 3, beginning in verse 14. Paul writes, "For this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named, that according to the riches of his glory he might grant you to be strengthened." Actually, we'll stop right there. For this reason I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named. And we read that and we go, all right, good for you, Paul. What does that mean? Because Paul kind of talks in a way here that we don't necessarily talk now. He starts off by saying, I bow the knee. When have you ever started a sentence that way? When have you ever started off a sentence you're like, well, I bow the knee to my... Like, no one says that. And so we say, Paul, what on earth does bowing the knee mean? And actually, culturally, it's a pretty clear, pretty simple, but also pretty significant thing. See, Paul was a Jew. I think that a lot of you guys probably know that. Paul was raised Jewish. And not only was he raised Jewish, but he was actually brought up to be a Pharisee, to be a religious teacher. And Paul, this order that he was educated in, would normally pray standing up. They'd stand up, they might, put their arms out, they might look up, but they normally pray standing up. And so when you bowed your knees, when you got on your knees for the sake of prayer, and we'll actually see in a minute, this is indeed a prayer that he's doing here. When you make the action of getting on your knees or even bowing down and exposing the back of your neck, being kind of like prone on the ground, if you do anything like that, the idea is that you're praying very intensely. So a normal prayer is standing up, and then if you get on your knees, this is the way that they were taught, the way that they operated. If you get on your knees, then it's like a really important prayer. It's a really intense prayer. And so Paul says, for this reason, I bow my knees. Okay. So Paul has this really intense prayer that he wants to give to God. And then he offers him a little bit of praise in verse 15. You actually see him offer more praise later. He says, I bow my knees before the Father, from whom every family in heaven and on earth is named. And we're sitting here and we're kind of going, Paul, that's awesome for you. I'm happy. I'm happy that you're like, man, I just love God so much. I'm just praising God right now, having a really intense prayer session, getting down on my knees and praying to him. That's great. But you don't have coronavirus, Paul. But you didn't just lose your job, Paul. Things might be going pretty good for you. Actually, when he's writing Ephesians, things might be going okay for him. So you're asking, Paul, it's good for you. We're happy that you're happy. We're happy that you're praising God. But what about us? What's the reason that Paul has to be praising God? Whatever's going on in his life, what reason does he have? He says, for this reason. What is this reason? And to get the answer to that question, we're actually going to have to go back to chapter 2. Because see, Paul, I don't know how much of Paul's writings you've read, but Paul gets distracted occasionally. And so Paul actually tried to start this prayer back in verse 1, and then he kind of got distracted for a minute, and he just started like ranting about something else. And he's like, wait a minute. I was praying. I'm sorry, guys. Let me get back to it. And he actually starts over here in verse 14. So back in chapter 3, verse 1, he actually starts off and he says, for this reason, I, Paul, and then he gets distracted and he starts talking about this awesome ministry that he has, how he's an apostle, how he's a missionary to the Gentiles. And then he stops and he's like, wait, I was doing a prayer. Let's finish that up. For this reason, I bow my knees. And so you want to have this reason, you actually have to go back to when he tried to start the prayer, back in verse 1, where he's pointing back to chapter 2. And what is Paul talking about in chapter 2? What's this big reason he's so unbelievably thankful for? It's pretty simple. Paul in chapter 2 is talking about how the Gentiles and the Jews are now one family. And it doesn't seem like a big of a deal for us. But you have to think about this. The Jews were raised believing that the Gentiles, the Romans and the Greeks especially, were inferior, that they were infidels. And not only that, but they were violent. They didn't believe in God. They were ruthless. They were brutal. And they'd come in and taken over the Jewish homeland. And the Jews hated the Gentiles. They viewed them as oppressors, as evil, as contrary to God's will, as lesser human beings. And the Gentiles, they didn't like the Jews either. They saw the Jews as being backwards, as being this agricultural, earthy people. They weren't well educated. They weren't real smart. They believed things that no one else believed. Like everyone else in the world believed there were many gods. There was a god of the sea, a god of the air, a god of the forest. But the Jews believed there was only one God. And that was just weird. That was some backwards thinking. People didn't think that way then. They didn't really put a lot of stock in philosophy. They didn't have a big ranging empire. Their vocabulary was pretty small. Hebrew was a pretty simple language compared to the huge vocabulary of Greek and Latin. And so the Romans and the Greeks, the Gentiles, kind of looked down on the Jewish people. These two groups, they didn't like each other. They didn't mesh very well. And Paul's saying, at some point over the last couple decades, when Jesus died, when me and Peter and John and all these guys have been doing a lot of ministry stuff, God's taken these two groups that hate each other and has moved them together and made them one family. And not just one family, but one family in God. God's like the dad. He calls God the Father here, the Father of all families. He says, I bow my knee before the Father, the word there is pater, from whom every family, the word there is patria. It's actually a little bit of a pun, pater, patria, they kind of sound the same. He does a little pun there in the Greek. And it's supposed to draw out something. The word patria, or family, could also refer to people groups. So you could refer metaphorically to the English as a patria, as a family. You could refer to people from Nigeria as a patria, as a family. You could refer to people from Canada as a patria, as a family. So all these different people groups, all these different countries could metaphorically be called a family. And so when Paul says this is the father of all families, he's saying this is the father, this is the loving parent, this is the creator of, this is the originator of all people groups across the entire face of the earth. And I praise him because he's taken the Jews, and he's taken the Romans, he's taken the Greeks, he's taken the Ethiopians, and he's taken the Chinese, he's taken the Indians, and soon enough, he's going to take the Native Americans from the New World, and he's going to make them all one family. No matter what your race is, no matter what your background is, no matter how much money or how little money you have, no matter if you have a disease, if you don't have a disease, if you're physically disabled, if you're mentally disabled, or if you're lucky enough to not be. No matter who you are, no matter where you come from, no matter what descriptors fit you, you can be a part of this family. And Paul says, I'm praising God. I thank God for that. In the midst of this epidemic, we have a little bit of an issue with thankfulness, a little bit of an issue with praise. And Paul teaches us here a very simple truth, that our praise can grow because God's family is growing. And I know you might hear that. You might go, Jason, yeah, that's true back in the first century because Christianity was blowing up, but Christianity's not blowing up right now. Well, I would debate that. There's a really well-respected leader in Christian circles. His name's Carey Nieuwhof. He's kind of known as a leader's leader, as someone who invests in pastors and invests in church leadership, and he's a pretty well-respected guy. And he's recently started a new podcast, a guy that you might know named David Kinnaman. He's the president of a polling organization called the Barna Group. It's a Christian polling organization. They gather statistics. They do training for different churches, for church staff, that sort of thing. They're a really big deal. And they're very well respected for having unbelievably accurate statistics, accurate pictures of what's going on in the evangelical church. And David Kinnaman and Carey Nieuwhof, these two guys got together, they started a new podcast, and they cited a stat in this podcast recently. It's called Church Growth Weekly, I think. And they cited a new statistic in this podcast, that somewhere between 50 and 60% of evangelical churches in the U.S. are currently increasing in attendance. Prior to the COVID-19 outbreak, somewhere between 20 and 40% of churches were increasing in attendance, which means somewhere between 60 and 80, well over half of churches in the U.S. either weren't growing or were shrinking. And now, during this epidemic, just over the last few weeks, about 60% of churches, 50 to 60% of churches are growing. And we think, okay, well, maybe that's the mega churches, that's the big guys, but it's not. Actually, even the little churches are seeing an increase in attendance. There's another interesting statistic to go along with that. They're actually seeing a decrease in giving, and part of that is just because people are losing their jobs and they can't give as much, or they're scared, so they're scared to give, and that's understandable. But another reason for that, if your attendance is going up, but your giving is not going up, it usually means you have a lot of new believers. You have a lot of people, they're not invested in the church, they aren't ready to give money yet, they're just kind of showing up, and that's awesome, because it means you have new people watching. This whole COVID-19 thing, it broke out, it's wrecking lives, but the church is growing. And I think Paul would look at this situation and say, our praise can increase because God's family is increasing. Our praise can grow because God's family is growing. Why are they growing? Why are more people turning to God? I think that part of it is just that when crises happen, people have a tendency of turning towards God because it's so much bigger than them. And they're like, God, I can't control it, but you can, so I guess I ought to come back. But I think there's other reasons as well. Let me give you a handful of examples. Radiant Life Church in Festus, Missouri is currently providing steeply discounted childcare to medical personnel. It's a church that Maggie grew up in. Central Church in Las Vegas is already, before the crisis, was already the largest food bank in the Las Vegas area and has actually ramped up its output. It has become even larger to take better care of people that are losing income, losing jobs because of the COVID-19 crisis. They're actually partnered with the government in that. They aren't even doing it by themselves. They're working alongside the government to make the government more effective in helping people in that area. Numerous local churches have taken up the responsibility of shopping for the elderly or the immune compromised and other high-risk individuals. Even small churches like us, like Berean Christian Church, where I was just hired, or like Celestia's Chapel, Church of God in Blacksburg, where I grew up, are taking new steps, becoming more inventive, meeting on the internet instead of in person. And the world is starting to notice. They're logging on to join us in our online services. They're actually wanting to be a part of what we're doing, and that is absolutely amazing. It's absolutely terrific. They're curious about us. They're wanting to be a part of what we're doing, and God's family is growing. So we're a little scared right now, aren't we? We're just a little, if we're honest, a little bit terrified. We're anxious. Some of us are depressed. We're stir crazy. But Paul gives us a reason why, even in the midst of this, we can be thankful. Because God's family is growing. In the first century, God's family was growing because all of a sudden this message that had been contained to Israel for generations was spreading around the world. It was going into Africa, it was going into Asia, it was going into Europe. Paul was doing his missions in Europe. And Paul was saying, I'm praising God because he's just put all these people together and made one big happy family, and that family keeps getting bigger, and that's amazing. But the same thing's happening today. People are losing hope and they're turning to the church. People are looking around and saying, man, I wish that someone would just step up and would take a leadership role and would take care of people right now. And the church is doing it. And people are noticing. And God's family is growing. In the midst of this epidemic, we kind of ask ourselves, man, how can I praise? How can I be thankful right now? What is there good going on in the world? And Paul kind of answers us here. He tells us that no matter what's going on around us, our praise can grow because God's family is growing. I want to thank you guys for taking the time to join me today to kind of think through this, to think about how we're supposed to address our anxiety and our worry right now, how we can praise in the middle of this crisis. I know that the video probably isn't the best quality, the audio isn't the best quality. You probably hear Maggie cooking and talking in the other room, and that's all right because we're all just kind of here. We're all quarantining. We all don't have the access to all the same resources that we normally do. But I also want to challenge you guys. I don't just want to encourage you. I do want to encourage you, but I also want to challenge you guys to find ways that you, as Christians, if you are a believer, if you're not a believer and you're watching this, and just thank you for joining me, and I hope that this has helped to assuage your anxiety a little bit. But if you are a believer, ask yourself, what are ways that I can kind of set a precedent, that I can take care of other people, that I can set a good example? Maybe part of it's as simple as getting a cloth mask and wearing it when you're out, just to model obedience to the CDC's recommendations. Maybe part of it is shopping for an elderly neighbor or someone who you know is immune compromised so they don't have to risk going out themselves. Maybe part of it is just video calling or calling on the phone someone that normally you'd visit, normally you'd hang out with a friend or a family member, and just saying, hey, I really missed you. I just wanted to talk to you. I know we can't see each other face to face, but can we still interact anyways? There's a lot of different ways, and I'm sure you guys are a lot more creative than me and can come up with some even better ideas. But this is an amazing opportunity for us to set an example, to be witnesses, and help grow the family of God. Thanks for joining me today. I hope that you have an amazing week.